Hello, star people. This is APM, your cosmic detective and intrepid star guide, back again with episode 3, the Somerton Man mystery. We're going to be looking at Mercury's message in Saturn's scrutiny. So we're going to explore theories through Mercury and Saturn, their aspects in this particular chart, and some housekeeping. The Daily Stargazer newsletter is a free and paid version. You will find the notes in the link in the show notes, and you can also find us on YouTube, Pinterest and Instagram, link also in the show notes. And if you'd be so kind, if you like my Astroflow, please feel free to leave a review on Apple Podcasts in particular, and also in particular Spotify podcasts. Give us 5 stars so other astro-curious people can find us and benefit as well. And a trigger warning: discussion of death and mysterious circumstances might be activating for some people, so if this is a sensitive issue, you may sit this one out or do your best to take care of yourself. And now, onward. Okay, so we're talking about the Somerton Man, which is the case that dates back from the 1st of December 1948. That's post World War II and at the very beginning of the Cold War. And he was found with his head propped up on the seawall, legs outstretched and crossed at the ankles. He was well dressed. He was found with a packet of cigarettes which had a different brand of cigarette inside than the cheap brand that came originally in the packet. He had a note in his pocket. He had lovely clothing, but all of the labels were cut out, but the clothing was darned, meaning repaired, with linen orange thread that did not come from Australia, but did in fact come from the United States, which makes people wonder, was he a foreign national? That'll be Saturn in the 9th house, in addition to all of the planets in Sagittarius on the cusp of the 12th house of hidden things. Okay, so though that is what we have, it is a case that's been going on since 1948. I have heard tell of people thinking or believing they have found who it could possibly be, but the investigators leading it are not ready to say yay or nay. They don't feel they have enough empirical evidence to back up any claims about the case being solved and his identity being found. So that is where we're at as of this particular episode. We're going to be looking at the messenger, that's Mercury, meeting the taskmaster, that is Saturn. And so let's have a look at our chart. Now, Mercury in this chart is at 1 degree of Sagittarius, not in a comfortable place. Mercury is more comfortable in Gemini than it is in Sagittarius. Sagittarius is all big picture thinking and zoomed out, and Mercury tends to be zoomed in and detail oriented, so not the most comfortable place. Also, both signs deal with abstractions. However, Mercury in Sagittarius prefers experience rather than theories, whereas Mercury in Gemini is more comfortable in the realm of ideas, ideals, and theories, and so therefore abstractions. And we have a square between Mercury at 1 degree and Saturn at 5 degrees. That is a 4-degree orb. And that is, it's not terribly tight, but it is tense enough for it to be an area of focus. So we're looking at Mercury in Sagittarius. We're looking at broad thinking, foreign connections. And when I say foreign connections, I do not necessarily mean connections to another country. I also mean foreign connections as in things, ideas, concepts that might be foreign to us, or foreign to the investigators investigating the case, or foreign also to the victim that they found on the beach in Somerton Park Beach, which is outside of Adelaide in Australia on that particular day at about 6:30 a.m. And so we're looking at broad thinking. The reason why we're looking very broadly is because, well, first of all, you'd have to have details to be able to look at details. All we have is broad thinking, and broad thinking invites theories. Because that's how you solve cases. You form a theory, and then you find empirical data to either support or disprove that theory. Scientifically, you're not looking to find evidence per se that supports a theory. You're looking at all the ways empirically that this theory is not supported by evidence. But investigators operate the other way around. I have a theory. Does any of the evidence I have support that theory, which can make it quite difficult? Why? Because if you have a theory, your brain is going to be looking at ways to prove that theory, not disprove that theory. And sometimes when we have a theory that we're married to, committed to, it makes it very difficult for us to find other evidence, other theories that might better fit this evidence because we are attached to it being exactly the way we see it. That is the part of us that is human. And so investigators are human as well. And so they're going to have these same challenges. Now, Saturn in Virgo is in the 9th house. We're looking at detailed analysis and a methodical investigation. And I believe, from what I've seen, that the investigators did all that they could with the evidence that they had, and it usually came to them in an unexpected way. For example, the book of poetry appears having been tossed into someone else's car, and this person brings it forth to the investigators, and now they have the scrap of evidence, that little piece of evidence that comes from said book, that they might actually have where the book came from. I mean, where this torn piece of paper came from. They might actually have that in evidence because now they have the book. And the book is about love poetry. So is it possible that our victim was a victim of foul play? And as most investigators now know, foul play has quite very few instigators emotionally, motivators. And foul play can be love triangles gone wrong. Money is another one. Common. These are two of the most common ways of how people end up deceased, is usually crimes of stranger danger crimes, meaning crimes of strangers. But more than likely, as investigators will find, and usually find, the killer of most people is a lot closer to home and usually known to the victim. So it's quite possible that our Somerton man, the person, was he killed? I mean, that's what we have, poison. He died of, someone wanted to do him in. And he could have been lovelorn. And an investigator modern investigator, not one at the time, years later, because time passed and it became a cold case. And whilst there were witnesses who saw the Somerton man alive and well, or saw him, lying on the beach, or knew him and said nothing, it didn't make the case any easier. And so it went into being a cold case, as it is currently to this day. And so one of the theories that was not expressed, we're going to get into in a moment. So let me share some of the notes I've written. So when we're looking at Sagittarius, Mercury in Sag loves a good theory, really, and is curious to get the answers. The fact that those answers are hard to come by would not stop a determined investigator. So in a criminal and quantum astrology, which is investigating the mysterious and crimes through the lens of astrology, Mercury is about thinking about the thinking in the investigation. It would be inquisitive, holistic, and it would lean heavily on theories And the 12th house would be short on answers, long on theories, because the 12th house is about things being hidden. And there are a lot about more questions, Mercury and Sag in this case, thereby inviting theories than there are actually answers, which is something that a Mercury and Sag would love. Now, it's squaring off with Saturn and Virgo from the 12th house to the 9th house. Mercury loves a good mystery that has a lot of questions and can be asked, and wants those questions answered in an efficient and elegant manner, which is Saturn and Virgo. So much so that the details may be ignored or rejected altogether because they don't fit in the current framework or theory and are not believed sufficiently. Okay, so consider this. A belief bias could be at work here. Investigators are human too, as I've said, and belief bias is basically bias in favor of strongly held beliefs instead of considering details on their own merits, whether or not they support the facts of the case. So it's a case of getting the facts of the case to fit a theory, just speculating. There's no evidence that this occurred, but considering the fact that investigators have feelings, emotions, and beliefs, it could also absolutely happen. So those are my current notes on that, what I think Saturn in theory. So let's have a look forward and let's see what else. So we're looking at the taskmaster against the messenger, and those are some of my thoughts and ideas about that. Now, the square aspect is challenge. It's between the intuitive leaps and the factual evidence. As I've said, intuitive leaps require one to touch in with one's gut instinct, which is also very lunar in its vibe. But investigations cannot be built on what your gut is saying. Your gut has to be saying, this is the evidence, these are the facts, and does this evidence support these facts, and do these facts support this evidence, or are we going to have to start over again? So that's basically what it is. So the tension of a square is dealing with intuitive knowing, holistic knowing, versus facts. And so this configuration can affect the approach of an investigation. As I said, you have to speculate a lot, you have to produce theories a lot, and if you don't have a lot of evidence, as I've said, often in this case, you're going to have to make up theories, but also keeping in mind that investigators are human too, and the tendency sometimes can be, my gut is telling me this, and so I'm going to follow this and see if the evidence, make the evidence fit the theory, as opposed to making certain that that theory is in line with the evidence. Okay? And so let's look at Mercury. So the spy theory is, Mercury is basically a connection of communication and codes. In the back of this book was a code of 4 or 5 lines, and one of the modern day investigators decided to investigate further with his class, because he was a university professor and he was teaching a class on code breaking. He said, okay, all known codes of that time period, let's take this code through all of them and see if it is possible that it's one of them. It was not. Is it a new code that could possibly be used? Well, no. The answer to that is absolutely not. But what they did discover, according to their theories and their understandings, is that the code was the first word of words in English. So that begs the question, why would a person who speaks English naturally, what was he trying to remember? And more to the point, why would he create this code? Because it was a self-created code, and some believe to be nonsense, but I don't believe it was nonsense. If he wrote it down, he was intending to remember it. That's my opinion. And so the connection to communication and codes makes you think spies. But since this does not follow any known spy code, I think that theory was struck off rather quickly once they sorted out, that this is not a code. Now, at the time, they did investigate whether or not the code in the book of poetry given to the victim by a nurse named Justin who resided in the Adelaide area. It was Persian love poetry, and so that might give the investigators the idea that this may have been a love gone wrong, because who gives books of love poetry to strangers or to acquaintances? Okay, so that was their thinking. So one of the modern investigators came up with a new theory, and that is a tragic love story angle, and Mercury's placement in the 12th house is a water house, which is a relationship house, and it is the house of retreat. It is the house of hidden information and also emotional blinders there. Jupiter, as I said, would be calling the shots. It's doing so from the house of the victim. And it is on Mars. So the motivator here is to get answers, and to do so in a way that's efficient and supports the evidence that they have, and that the theories and the evidence line up neatly. And so Mercury's placement in the 12th house can make this more idealistic. And I found it very interesting that the professor, excuse me, I really need to drink some tea and I don't have any. Sorry. But his theory was, it's possible that this was a tale of love gone wrong. And it so happens that Nurse Justin had met a man and she'd given him poetry. They had gotten close, but then the war happened and they drew apart. And the theory goes as follows: he turns up back in Adelaide post World War II, ready to look her up and maybe get back in touch with her and maybe continue their relationship, only to find out that she was no longer interested and had in fact moved on with another gentleman, of which she had had a child, and they had a relationship, and she was trying to protect that relationship. And so, maybe distraught, our Somerton man went to the seawall to contemplate his choices, and then in despair took his own life. It sounds very romantic, quite frankly. It sounds like a romantic story, and that was one of the theories. So, one of the modern theories. I don't believe at the time that the investigators in the 1940s Australia had the opinion that this was a love gone wrong type deal. So that is one of them. That is one of the theories. Another theory is that our victim was caught in a honey trap. And Nurse Justin examines the bust, as I said, of the Somerton man and tells investigators that she doesn't know the man, but her body language suggests otherwise to seasoned investigators. Now, in the modern era, her daughter later tells the investigators that her mum admitted to knowing the man to her, and not only that, she shares further that her mum spoke Russian and taught Russian immigrants in the area, which is a curious detail, which, of course, in the minute you think Russia, you think spies, you think 1940s World War, post-World War II, you think Cold War, you think spies, and here we are. So, honey trap, this is how we get there. That also looks rather curious. But the investigators look at both and they're thinking, fascinating. Quite interesting, but not necessarily. It doesn't answer all their questions. They still ask why. Okay, so some curious details. Nurse Justin was pregnant in 1946. She eventually marries the father of her soon-to-be unborn child. And interesting thing about the son and the Somerton man, they share rare genetic traits. They have unusual ear hollow shapes. By the way, the ear hollows have names. The upper ear hollow is called the cymba, the lower, the cavum. You heard it here, star people. He has 2 lateral incisors missing, and this affects 2% of the population. So the likelihood of 2 people sharing those traits exactly are and they are unrelated is 1 in 10 million. So, could the love of loss and family be the cause of death? Is it possible? Investigators are curious. They want to know more as well, and so do I. So we're looking at Mercury, as I said, Mercury-Saturn aspects. As I said, it's in a water house, tend to be idealistic, keeping in mind that the person who came up with that theory, it speaks more to him and his life and his worldview than it speaks to the Somerton man. He was the only person who posited that this could be a story of love gone wrong or someone distraught over the loss of love, where no other investigator even considered that. They considered it as possible that someone that he was close to could have done him in because they had ill will, because this is how people die. That was an idea. So the Mercury in the 12th house could speak to some of that. Now, let's step to our suicide theory. Mercury-Saturn aspects to emotional indicators. I'm looking at Uranus in Gemini, conjunct 0 degrees descendant, facing off against that first house ascendant. And that would be, first house would have to do with the victim. And we've got home, Cancer, home and family. Roots, being able to put down roots. I mean, coming from war, you'd want to put down roots. I understand that you're in a time of chaos. What you probably want is to have the most safe, comfortable, conformist life that you could possibly imagine, because that would feel like heaven after serving in a war. And so we've got that unexpected of Uranus in the 6th house. Everyday investigations here. Every moment it seems like a new shock, a new twist is happening. And they're trying to trust their guts, but also, it may also be to the fact that from that first house to the 6th house and to the 7th house, someone who wants a family, who wants roots, who wants to lie down roots. And now we have potentially a child who shares genetic traits, 2 very rare genetic traits that this victim had. And so it points to what usually results in murder today, a relationship gone wrong, or gone wrong for one person. And so the investigators might wonder why someone might tell a tale. Well, if you're 1946, that's just slightly after World War II, you are trying to put down roots, you're trying to rebuild your life after the war, you've met a nice fellow, you're going to have a baby, that sort of thing says, I want it to be calm, I want it to be comfortable, I want to rebuild my life, kind of vibe. And some stranger coming in to upset that, especially if it might be possible that the child you're carrying might actually be his, adds a little kerosene onto a fire that doesn't need kerosene. Okay, so we're looking at Mercury-Saturn, that Mercury-Saturn aspect. I'd say it's less about the emotion of the thing, or the idealism about love, and more to the fact that I would say that I would be looking at Uranus and the descendant opposing the ascendant. The base being that when we have a push and a pull between thinking and feeling. And sometimes feelings tend to win, especially when you've got a chance toward having a family and having a stable life again, which a lot of people do want. Then we have the poisoning theory. And this one doesn't have as a lot of support, because whilst we have physical indicators, there was a lot of blood internally there was a lot of blood internally with the victim, meaning in places where you wouldn't expect it to be, in his stomach. And some of his organs were a little enlarged, which does not speak to good health. And so giving those indicators, some poisons can present physically in the body that way. However, there was no evidence, because the cigarettes, no one thought to test them back then. And so they got tossed out with a lot of the evidence, which made it hard to test anything, to get any more evidence, to get any more clues, to have a stable theory. And keeping in mind that forensic medicine at that time was still developing. It hadn't reached the level that it is currently now and will be in the future. They were still very much boots on the ground, developing the ideologies and the techniques that eventually other investigators would draw upon and build upon. And that is also Uranian in its energy. Technology is always Uranus. So if I'm looking for poison, I'm going to be looking for, because people don't poison people openly. They don't say, hey, I'm going to poison you. So I'd be looking at the 12th house to see any indicators of poison. What I see there is Mercury, and I see Chiron. Chiron is about injury, and keeping in mind, if you know the myth of Chiron, you know the myth of poisoning, because Chiron was injured by a poison arrow that had accidentally been shot into his foreleg or his post leg or whatever, his legs, one of his legs. I would say his flanks, by the hero Heracles, otherwise known to the Romans as Hercules. And so you could look at that Chiron on Mercury, because Chiron's at 0 degrees, Mercury's at 1 degree in Sagittarius, in the 12th house, a hidden poisoning. And so that aspect could illuminate a poison theory. I might look there. And I would also want to see, I want to check out Chiron talking to, Chiron would be quincunx to that descendant. But I'm going to see if I can find anything tight. I'm not finding anything terribly tight beyond Black Moon Lilith. Yeah, I'm not finding anything terrifically tight beyond having that Chiron and Saturn. Saturn's a little wider than I would like. It's 5 degrees. I prefer, if I'm going to do an event chart, I prefer 4 degrees. I like them to be a bit tighter. 5 degrees is a little wide for my taste. And the reason why it's set this way is I have a tendency to set it and forget it with my aspects. So there are not a lot of aspects in this chart beyond the quincunx and the opposition. The opposition would be the strategy of to Pallas. And I might as well have a look and see what Pallas is doing. Pallas is retrograde and also out of bounds. So let's talk about this quickly. Pallas is about creative strategy. It's hanging out in the 6th house, co-present with Uranus. So that energy is tending to be very airy, lots of ideas. It can also be scattered. That's a thing. You've got a lot of information. It is spread out across this area of Australia and sometimes abroad. And so the energy tends to it can be scattered. It can be confusing. It can be, disillusioning. Okay, so we're looking at creative brilliance, creative genius, and we're looking at Pallas hanging out at about 4 degrees. Here, so we're looking at the Chiron, 4 degrees. It's doable, in my opinion. It's quite doable. And it is, when I'm looking at that, I'm looking at the ability to be objective, the ability to be impartial, the ability to use reason, to stand back and to avoid telling a narrative, no matter how fanciful that narrative might be, no matter how wonderful it might be, until we can back that up with evidence. Now, keeping in mind that Pallas is in a square with a 1-degree orb with Saturn at 5 degrees in the 9th house in Virgo. So that is definitely a square, and you've got the challenge of two energies. All these ideas, all this evidence, and by I say evidence, I mean theories. All these theories and all these different ideas, different pieces of evidence in the 6th house in the investigation. So basically, our boots on the ground, coming up with new ways, new mutable ways to stay curious, stay inquisitive, but very mutable ways of being able to work this case because it's constantly shifting. And what you know today will be changed by some fact, some shocking, unexpected fact tomorrow. Now, so we're looking at Uranus, and eventually we'll look at that. But I'm sorry, I mean to say we're looking at Pallas, and we're looking at Chiron. Chiron is a story about someone who is wounded by a poison arrow, which speaks to our poison theory. It is right on top of Mercury. Mercury, we're talking about communication codes. We're also talking about theories. And that Pallas right there is all of the theories, an abundance of theories, which are all stories, but very little evidence. And it cautions us against telling a great story at the expense of the facts that they currently had, which was precious little, even to this day. So we're looking at the theories through the mercurial lens. That would be how I would see it. Now, if we're looking at Saturn for truth-seeking, I just mentioned that Saturn in a square with Pallas would be about the truth-seeking. It'd be about that analytical lens, because Virgo is an analytical earth sign. It wants details, it wants efficiency, it wants I's dotted, T's crossed, keeping in mind that Saturn in Virgo is the chart ruler of this particular discovery chart that is dated on the 1st of December 1948 at 6:30 a.m. So we're looking, the facts man, just the facts, okay? And there might be some biases. So as I said, Saturn square Mercury has an impact on perception. You want to be efficient, but there's also a pressure socially that you're going to bring this case in so that your superiors will have that on lockdown. And the longer it gets where there are no answers, the more antsy people become, the more restless people become, and the more it invites insane out there theories. And the further away we get from evidence and facts, and we get into more just the fantastical, which is what Neptune represents. Okay? So Saturn wants facts. Mercury loves a theory, loves a story, and those two are in a square aspect, which means facts against theories. And you have Chiron in a square. I'm just getting all fuddled here. I meant to say Saturn in a square with Pallas in Gemini, in opposition to everything, to some of those early planets in Sagittarius. And now you have all of the stories, all of the ideas, but you don't have the evidence. Saturn wants evidence. It wants facts. It wants those theories. Okay, do they line up with what we got? And some of them, sadly, they do. And so we're looking at research methods. We're looking at meticulous research methods, doing everything you can to preserve the evidence, doing everything you can to focus on not stories, not theories, not just gut instincts, but what you can actually prove. That's Saturn and Virgo's influence. So when we're talking about detailed forensic work in this particular case, the investigators were doing the best they could. Every new lead, the suitcase that they found of the Somerton man's effects, running down a book of poetry that was found from a scrap of paper found in his pocket, and running down the cigarettes, which were a cheap brand, an expensive brand put into a cheap packet, and they're thinking, why would one do that? And finding evidence internally of injury, but they can't sort out what sort of injury it was and for when it happened, per se. And then finding a case that went back 3 years of a poisoning that was also not certifiably solved. And at that same hotel, a suspect named Boxall happens to be dining with the witness, Nurse Justin, who happens to give him a book of Persian love poems, rubaiyat, as she had done, allegedly, with the Somerton man victim. And that's reading as quite coincidental to our investigators in Australia then and in the global community now. Okay, so this case is still very much a cold case. And to this day, detailed forensics, they're doing their best, but this is a very old case, almost 80 years old. And so evidence thin on the ground. People who could have helped are no longer with us. But a curious note, as I've said, is that the current leaning is that the Somerton man and the nurse knew each other, and it is possible they had a close relationship that eventually went their separate ways during the war and came together after the war. And it's possible when they did so after the war, they found that they were both in very different places. And I wish I had a nice little way to lace this up in a pretty way, but I don't. So here are some of my key takeaways, and they're as follows. So Mercury and Saturn dynamics can influence case interpretation. Keeping in mind, Mercury has all the ideas, it has the stories, it's the one that would make up the theories. And Mercury in Sagittarius is a big picture thinking. But Saturn likes details. It wants everything to be microscoped, not telescoped. Okay, so it's interested in zoom in rather than zoom out. And keeping in mind that investigators, then as now, are still human beings with a job to do. Okay, so to wrap up this series, here, that's my connecting thought. Those are my insights on what I think. Now, here's what I think. Here's my theory. My theory is that the Somerton man was the Russian agent, that he was friendly with the nurse. He came back to see her. She had what allegedly a young man who might be his child. He found out she'd moved on. He went to the wall to have a sit down, to have a think, and may have expired. You know, just that happens. And that the code in the book of poetry was simply him trying to learn English so that he could communicate with the woman that he really obviously still cared about. That's my theory, that's my speculation. There's evidence that can support that, but it's not conclusive. So I will say that. So, with that being said, thank you very much for listening. And you can find more information on this case if you're willing to go down rabbit holes on the internet. And we have a daily Stargazer newsletter for those of you who like your cosmic data on the daily. You can find me on YouTube, Pinterest, and Instagram And if you want to support my work, you can do so on Ko-fi, and that link will be in the show notes. Thank you very much for listening, and consider this: even the stars hold secrets, and they also light the way to truth. Peace and astro magic.